All right, today we're going to dive into something pretty fascinating. We're looking at three really core ideas that create this deep theological divide between Mormonism and classical Christianity. So, what we're going to do is take a really fair, impartial look at the big arguments, the nature of God, the ultimate destiny of humanity, and the history of the church itself. When you think about it, every faith system is really built on these foundational pillars, right? These core beliefs that shape literally everything else. So today, we're zeroing in on three of those pillars within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and seeing how they stack up against more traditional Christian views. So here's the game plan. First, we're going to tackle the concept of God himself. Then we'll get into humanity's ultimate destiny. And finally, we'll look at the historical claim of apostasy and restoration before we tie it all together. Sound good? Let's get into it. Okay, so our first major point of divergence, it's a big one. It's all about the very nature of God. And you could argue this is the most fundamental distinction between Mormonism and classical theism. It's where it all starts. And right here, you can see two totally different views of God laid out side by side. On one hand, you have the Mormon doctrine that God the Father is an exalted man with a physical body, and on the other, the classical theist view that God is an eternal, non-physical spirit. This single difference creates a massive ripple effect through all of theology. It changes everything. So this immediately raises a huge theological question, right? If you believe God the Father was once a man and has a physical body, how do you square that with biblical passages that seem to describe God in a completely different, non-physical way? Well, the classical view really leans on verses like this one from John. It's seen as a cornerstone, defining God as spirit, something immaterial. And yeah, some people will point to being made in God's image and say that it implies a physical body. But the traditional understanding has always been that it's about spiritual stuff, like our ability to reason and love, not that we physically look like God. Then there's this idea of God's immutability, basically that he's unchanging. And this creates a really direct contrast. The Mormon view describes a God who progressed, who evolved from being a man to being God. But then you have scriptures like this one from Malachi, which present a God who is eternal, with no beginning and no possibility of changing. And finally, we've got the question of strict monotheism. The Mormon teaching of a plurality of gods, where God the Father is one among many, is set against the Bible's constant, repeated emphasis that there is one and only one God, period. All right, let's pivot to our second theme, which honestly flows directly from the first one. If God was once a man, well, what does that imply for the rest of us? This quote right here, this famous couplet from a former president of the LDS Church, just perfectly sums up the doctrine of exaltation. It's so powerful and memorable. As man now is, God once was. As God now is, man may be. It lays out this belief that humans can literally follow the same path of progression as God the Father. So, just to be super clear, this whole concept is called exaltation. It's the teaching that the ultimate goal for faithful Mormons isn't just to be with God, but to actually become gods themselves, with the potential to create and rule over their own worlds. And this is where we hit a really fascinating point of tension, because you have this goal of exaltation, but then you set it against the biblical story of the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. And it raises this really powerful question about what humanity's ultimate purpose is supposed to be. This is the line. This is the serpent's promise to Adam and Eve in the garden. And it's absolutely central to the counter-argument against the doctrine of exaltation. So the crucial point being made here is all about narrative framing. From this classical perspective, the promise of becoming like God isn't some future glory to aspire to. No, it's identified as the original lie, the exact temptation that introduced sin and separation from God into the world in the first place. Now, you might be thinking, wait, don't some Christian traditions talk about something kind of similar? And you're right, there's a concept called theosis, but there is a massive difference here. Theosis is all about partaking in God's divine nature through grace. It's a change in your relationship with God. It's about union. Exaltation, on the other hand, is about becoming a separate and equal deity. That's a change in your fundamental being, two very different ideas. Okay, that brings us to our third and final point, and this one shifts gears a bit from pure theology to history. It challenges the very reason, the foundational premise, upon which Mormonism says it needed to exist. And that premise is this concept right here, the great apostasy. This is the belief that after the original apostles died, the church that Jesus founded didn't survive. It fell into complete error, it lost its authority, it lost the true doctrines, and because of that, it needed a complete restoration centuries later through Joseph Smith. So this creates another one of those core tensions, right? You have the claim of a total apostasy on one side, and you put it directly against a promise that Jesus himself supposedly made about the long-term survival of his church. And honestly, this is why this point is so critical. The claim to be the restored church is absolutely central to Mormonism's identity. I mean, think about it. If there wasn't a total apostasy in the past, then the need for a total restoration in the 1800s, well, from a theological standpoint, it just isn't necessary. The argument for the church's indefectibility, that's the idea that it could not completely fall away, really hinges on this one verse from Matthew. Christ's promise is seen as a direct guarantee from him that his church would survive, that it would continue on through history. And this idea is backed up by a few other things, too. You've got Jesus' promise to always be with the church to the close of the age. You've got the church being described as the pillar and bulwark of the truth. And then there's the traditional Christian doctrine that public revelation closed with the death of the last apostle, which would mean there's no need for new post-biblical scriptures to come along later. Okay, so let's pull all these threads together now and do a quick recap of the 3 core theological tensions we've just walked through. And you can see how it all flows logically, can't you? First, you have a different view of God's very nature. That leads to a completely different goal for humanity. And that difference in destiny is then justified by a different view of the church's history and its authority. One point really leads to the next. Because at the end of the day, these questions, who is God, what can we become, and what happened way back in history, they're not just some abstract theological debate. They profoundly shape how a faith understands its purpose, its authority, and its identity in the here and now. And that is a crucial takeaway, no matter what you believe. Thanks so much for joining me for this one.